The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Programman Taylor, and this is episode 11, using Lizzie to secure your apps, with Thomas Hansen. In this episode, I interviewed Thomas Hansen about his programming language Lizzie, what it is and how you can use it to secure your applications. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. Thank you very much for being on the podcast, Thomas. It's very kind of you to donate some time to talk about your new project.
Thank you. It's very pleasant, and I'm excited to be here too.
Oh, fantastic. So for the people who listen to the podcast but may not know of your work, could you give us a quick introduction?
Yeah, so I'm a software developer, obviously. I work in both ends, front end, back end. Obviously, I work a lot with .NET. And I've actually been coding since I was 8 years old, believe it or not. And I'm 44 today, so that makes couple of generations almost. So I work currently in finance industry, creating CRM systems, exchange systems, stuff to do trading, etc. I guess that's the spiel.
Okay, cool. Because of the magic involved in podcasts, we're recording this a few weeks before it goes out, obviously. But I said on an episode that went out recently that there's a wonderful different set of origin stories to developers. You said you've been coding since you were around 8 years old. And I think I'm kind of the same. I wrote a little blog post years ago about the first computer program I'd ever written, and it was 10 print hello world 20 run.
No, sorry. Let me debug that program. 20, go to 10.
Yeah, so just prints hello world forever. I like it.
That's what it's supposed to do. Mine was 10, print Thomas is cool. 20, go to 10. Actually, this is so fun. So, I'm writing articles for MSDN Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I've already finished my next article. And it's coming out in November. And actually, in that article, that is actually one of the code examples. Believe it or not. 10, print Thomas is cool. 20, go to 10. And this was, of course, on an ORIC. In 1982, I think. So probably before most of your listeners were even born, I presume.
It's really cool to hear of the different sort of origin stories that people have when they come to development. Like you or I started really, really young, but there are different people who come in and they've maybe been in finance for years and years and decided they want to learn JavaScript or whatever to help automate their life. And then they realize this is loads of fun. I want to go create things for a living. So it's always really fun to hear how people got into the business, as it were.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting, I've philosophied a lot about this, about code and software development a lot. And when you look at the industry and you look at all the titans, such as Alan Kay and, Alan Turing, for that matter, all of the really, really famously, extremely skilled software developers, almost all of them have some sort of artistic skill, in addition to being extreme software developers. And Alan Kay, for instance, and a lot of these people often don't have computer science degrees. Alan Kay has a PhD in biology, for instance. Richard Stallman, all of these guys, they often tend to have completely different set of skill sets and came into software development from the side, arguably. So I find that interesting, at the very least.
Yeah, I've always found that, like you're saying, a lot of the best developers always have something that brought them in, or they have something that keeps them entertained for, creation's sake. So I know a lot of developers who are writers, so they'll write stories and scripts and little jokes and skits and stuff. and I know a few developers who are musically inclined. So there's a group of developers that I talk to on Slack who are, very, very, very talented musicians,
And actually, that makes a lot of sense. Because actually, most people tend to have the wrong assumption about code. They tend to believe that I write code such that the computer can do what I want it to do. Well, actually, that's the job of the compiler. You write code such that other human beings can read that code. And that's why I think it is so important to have skills beyond just pure math, pure logic, and pure left hemisphere type of brains. And obviously, once the right hemisphere and the right parts of your brain comes into picture, often this tends to make you musically inclined, artistically inclined, good with writing stuff, etc., etc. It's a really interesting phenomenon, actually.
Unfortunately, we're not here to talk about the wonderful, interesting phenomenon of developers being creative, both left side and right side of their brains. What we actually are here to talk about today is Lizzie. So I was wondering if you could give us an introduction to your new project, Lizzie.
So Lizzie is my latest open source project. It's MIT licensed, and it's a dynamic scripting language for .NET. You see, as I'm studying languages, I mean, having done software development for 36 years, obviously I know dozens of programming languages. And I've always envied PHP, although I've never been a PHP developer. I mean, for instance, on my WordPress blog, I can log into the dashboard, I can open a PHP file, and I can edit it and change my blog. I can change the code that's running on the server from my browser. And, this is such an amazingly cool feature to do for anybody who has never been able to do this because they are using statically compiled programming languages, that I figured, you know what, the static developers, they deserve this too. So I figured, how could I make C# and .NET and the Common Language Runtime more dynamic? And obviously, the answer to that is Lizzie. I guess that's the 2-minute introduction to Lizzie.
I'm always interested to find out where the name for projects come from. So one of my open source projects is called DW Check API, and it's a web API for looking into the Discworld books. So all the books written by Terry Pratchett, they're all revolve around the Discworld series, because I'm a huge fan of Terry Pratchett, and I'm forever going into a bookstore and going, do I have this physical copy of this book? So I have a little API that helps me to figure out whether I've checked them off or not. What I'd like to know is, does the name Lizzie have a special meaning to you?
It's actually my girlfriend's nickname. So I've literally created a programming language named up after my girlfriend. But I guess a lot of people would probably presume it comes from like Lisp, right? Because obviously it has a lot of similarities to Lisp, even though it isn't Lisp. I mean, not even by a far stretch. It's much more simpler. I mean, the reference documentation is only 12 pages, although still it kind of like feels a little bit Lispish in nature. So probably a lot of people will assume it comes from Lisp, but Lisbeth is actually my girlfriend's name, and her nickname in English is arguably Lizzie, you might say. So I've literally recreated my girlfriend in my computer. I don't know if that is some sort of psychiatric diagnosis or something, by the way. It might be, for all I know.
All I know is that if somebody created a computer programming language called Jamie and told me that I was the inspiration for it, I'd be flattered.
Probably, yeah. Well, depending upon who it is, I guess.
Okay, so what kind of things can I do with Lizzie then?
Yes, so it's dynamic. It is a script language, arguably, quote-unquote, not entirely though, because it's actually not interpreted. And actually, it's not even compiled either. Although nobody believes me when I tell them it's neither. But anyway, that's a long technical debate, which I obviously know I'll win once they start actually looking at the code. But what you can do is that you can create dynamic code. And this code reaches into your C# methods and your C# objects, allowing you to mix statically typed C# classes and assemblies with dynamically interpreted Lizzie code, which you can fetch from your database. You can read it from dynamically the text files, or you can actually send it over the wire. So I can have a client, for instance, that creates Lizzie code, transmits it over a web service to an HTTP REST endpoint. Then the server executes my code. And this all of a sudden allows me to create a client and a web service solution where I have inverted the responsibility of who contains the business logic, right? So all of a sudden I can put my entire business logic into the client layer in, for instance, things such as JavaScript. I could create a front end in Angular and put my entire business logic in JavaScript, and then have my JavaScript dynamically create Lizzie code that it transmits to my server, which my server then securely, may I add, executes and creates some sort of result that it returns back to the client. So all of a sudden I can take an existing web service, API REST endpoint with like hundreds and thousands of endpoints for stuff like, customers get/ID 1000, and I can replace it with one simple HTTP post endpoint, because the client decides itself what type of domain objects and stuff like that it wants to have returned from the server. So that's a pretty cool feature, I think. So in a way, this facilitates for inversion of responsibility, where it's not actually the server that contains the business logic and decides what it wants to actually execute, but in fact the client. And all of this is easily done in such a way that it's 100% secure.
Do you mind if I take a step back and just unpack a few of the things there? So you have a dynamic language which is being interpreted or run in C# land. Your interpreted language is telling C#.NET to do some stuff. C#.NET does what it's told and it returns the data. And then wherever that command came from, you can return the data back to wherever that command came from. I'm getting the feeling it's a little like Lua, in that you can have a C++ thing, a class or an object or something, and you can use Lua to extend the abilities of it. But like you were saying, you could have a web client that generates this script and sends it down the wire, and then instead of having a thin client and a server, you then have, I guess, a medium client and a dumb server?
Exactly. I wish I knew enough about Lua to answer that question. You had kind of like a question if it's like similar to Lua or not. I obviously know about Lua. I've read a little bit about it and stuff like that, but I've never done any serious development in it, and I haven't studied it enough to say whether or not Lizzie is similar to it or not.
Sure.
But it might very well be. I mean, obviously, I'm not like the first guy in history who has this idea. But yes, you basically turn the server into a dumb box that really arguably does nothing besides exposing some Lizzie methods or functions, which you can invoke, passing in your own Lizzie code. At which point, obviously, stuff like authentication and authorization is arguably the only thing you actually have to worry about. And then when you've done this, you can create like generic, for instance, mysql.customers.get, taking like an argument telling which field you'd like to sort on, how many records you'd like, the offset, etc. And then when you extract that code from like your MySQL database on the server, the client decided which records it wanted to extract. Then you can further massage these records. And for instance, add on, okay, I want every single contact for every single customer for the first 10 customers sorted alphabetically, descendingly by their name. So you can then imagine this if you were to create it using just HTTP REST endpoints. You'd have to do multiple HTTP REST requests, right? Because first you'd have to get all customers, then you'd have to iterate over every customer and get every single contact. This would create, if you were to display 10 customers, at the very least 11 HTTP requests. With Lizzie, you can reduce it to 1. Simply because first you get all the customers, then you go to the other table and get etc., etc.
So you said that it would do it securely. Is this because you're handling the authorization and authentication in C# land at your single REST endpoint? Or is it more a case of it's secure because you don't have 500 API endpoints to figure out the authentication for and to watch for rate limiting and stuff like that?
The reasons why it is secure is because out of the box, Lizzie can't really do anything. I mean, the only thing it can do, it can add integers and split strings. And then it can do a for each over lists and dictionaries. It doesn't even have a while keyword. So there's no way, if you just install Lizzie out of the box on a web server and expose in REST endpoint, there's absolutely no way a malicious client can in any ways compromise that server beyond DDoS. But I mean, that's stuff it can do anyways. It doesn't contain the capacity to in any ways modify the state of the computer where the code runs, right? So when I start extending Lizzie, Lizzie is a domain-specific language template, quote-unquote, you might say. Because when you want to use it, you can't, I mean, Lizzie has absolutely no value out of the box. You have to extend it with your own C# methods and delegates and functions that you expose into your Lizzie code. So if I, for instance, create a function to my Lizzie endpoint that says get customers or get whatever, some sort of like domain object, then at that point I can, within my C# method, verify that, hey, is this user authenticated? Is he authorized to select data from this table, etc., etc. Now, if you can create that generically, which is kind of like my dream, then you actually have a server query language where you simply have a generic, completely 100% dumb server that you can attach to any database, any file system, anything really you want to, and then just configure that server's authorization and authentication. And then you have the same server backend for every single possible application you create. And this is actually possible, at least in theory. The same way you're using the same database vendor for every single database app on the planet. I mean, obviously you're not doing that because you have multiple database vendors. You have Oracle, you have MS SQL, you have MySQL. But it's not like as if you need a special database engine every single time you create a new app. I mean, when you create a new app, you choose one database vendor, right? This database vendor takes care of your data. It's a data bucket, generic, that regardless of how your domain model looks like, you can somehow manage to map your domain object and use as a data storage for that application. In the same way, Lizzie becomes that same thing. It becomes like a generic server query language in such a regard, allowing you to post just Lizzie code. And then the server is configured with authentication and authorization in regards to letting that code actually execute or not, depending upon whether or not the user is authenticated and authorized. Did that make sense, by the way?
What I'm seeing as you're describing it is, because we can then have a dumb server, we could have, as long as you have a load balancer in front of it, you could have elastic scale for free.
Yeah.
You don't have to write a microservice. You don't have to have all of these you don't need to use containers for elastic scale anyway, but you don't have to create message pumps and pass things around and check whether that service is running and that service is running. So I'm seeing 100,000 users with a HTTP client each, so a browser, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, whatever, and they're all sending their data to this endpoint. There's a load balancer which is taking all of these and forwarding onto different servers which are all running the same system. And then because Lizzie is being used on the server and the authentication has already happened, your server costs you almost nothing to run, I presume.
Yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense. That would be a very good architecture. And actually, you were into something very interesting too, which was this elastic part too. And one thing that's really cool with Lizzie is that it's very easy. For instance, I just recently, and it was like 3 lines of code, I added protection for, because I realized there was actually one security flaw in Lizzie, and it was based upon Stack Overflow. For instance, if I created a function that invoked itself just recursively without ever returning and interrupting that recursive function invocation, then obviously at some point I'd eat up the stack for my CLR runtime, right? And this would throw an exception. Now, whether or not this is actually a security flaw or not, you might argue, but I mean, definitely it would make my server slower. It would make it much easier to, like, break a server down such that it no longer could handle other requests. So it would be like a DDoS backdoor, quote unquote. So I implemented the support for setting maximum level of function invocations, such that now you can set the number to 20 or 50 or 50,000 or something if you want to, at which point when you invoke one function, that function invokes another function, that function invokes another function, and then you have like a cycle that goes on. If you've set it to 20, if it invokes the 21st function, it will stop and throw an exception. Now, these types of mechanisms are also very easily implemented on stuff like CPU time, other things, etc., such that you can schedule a Lizzie endpoint and say, okay, this request here originates from a person who's authenticated into this role. People belonging to this role are not allowed to use more than maximum 5 seconds of CPU time before we throw an exception. And features like that are very easy to implement on Lizzie. So even though it's a pathetically small and pathetically simple and easily understood, arguably naive programming language, it also have these like monstrosity scaling capabilities, such as your example, for instance, definitely was a use case where you have like a load balancer and you can just transmit Lizzie code to like a server farm that in theory could, consist of 10,000 servers. I find it very enthusiastic to work on, and I find the project interesting. And this is actually the open source project I've released that have had the most interest. So obviously there is a need.
Is it .NET or is it .NET Core? I guess is the first question I need to ask. Does it support both framework and core, or is it just core, or is it .NET Standard?
Well, Lizzie is implemented in .NET Standard.
Okay, so it's implicitly across all of the formats then?
Yeah. So when you add a reference to it, you can add a reference to it in literally everything, I believe. I'm not entirely sure about the list of things it supports, but I actually only have one DLL. There's only one assembly. And it links perfectly well into everything I've tried it on, which ranges from .NET Core, WebAPIs to console, .NET Framework 4.5 assemblies, etc., etc. And actually, if you build your server accepting Lizzie code, you can have other types of clients. You can create a client in Java, you can create a client in Objective-C, you can create etc., etc. So if I can solve that server query language, quote unquote, problem, or if the community together with me could solve it, then arguably it's no longer a .NET project, because you don't need to develop in .NET any longer. And you can still have a .NET server, and the fact that it's a .NET server is completely irrelevant because the server simply accepts Lizzie code. So it would be like MySQL in such a regard. You can use it on every single language on the planet.
Let's say I've created a brand new, an ASP.NET Core application, and I want to include Lizzie. I just go install package Lizzie, and then it's done? Or do I need to do more wiring up once I've done that?
No, that's it. But obviously, once you've done that, to make it useful, you can execute and evaluate Lizzie snippets by simply compiling a piece of Lizzie code, but it won't arguably do much intelligent before you start binding your Lizzie code to C# classes and instances. And then you can easily expose methods on these bound C# classes, such that they become functions you can invoke from Lizzie. And that's kind of like the real beauty about it, the simplicity that Lizzie gives you in regards to making it very easy to invoke C# methods on bound instances of CLR types. So obviously that's a job you need to do in addition. The website contains an example to do a simple write line, and also have some code that allows you to just create a generic HTTP REST endpoint, but which obviously doesn't do anything. From there on, it's whatever your domain problem happens to be.
Does the Lizzie code have to be generated by anything specific, or can it literally just be, as long as your application can take a message and send it to Lizzie, it doesn't matter how that message got there, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can fetch your Lizzie code from a database, you can fetch it from files, you can fetch it over a socket, over an HTTP request, etc. It's very, very technologically agnostic. And when I use the use case of HTTP REST endpoints, obviously that's one use case. I mean, it doesn't really have anything to do with HTTP. There is no references to HTTP in Lizzie. You could arguably use it as an AI scripting engine for games too, if you wanted to control non-playing characters, etc.
If I had, say, a JSON blob of some data, and my boss said to me, I need you to go through this data and remove some fields, or I need you to fix something. Everyone's typed their first name in uppercase, but I want you to format it to proper case, so the first character is an uppercase character and the rest are lowercase characters. And if I knew how to do that with Lizzie, I could then have a generic console app that has Lizzie with, a combination of the C# console app and the Lizzie script. I could say, go open this file, change these characters, validate this input, do something to the file, and then drop out without having to write lots of boilerplate C# code?
Well, that particular use case is probably possible because Lizzie contains a couple of string manipulation functions and stuff like that out of the box. But you'd probably benefit from, at the very least, creating maybe one or two C# methods, which would do like, if starts with capital letter or whatever your example was, then etc. But yes, you could easily do that, but you'd need, regardless of what you want to use Lizzie for, it's arguably useless before you've added at least one C# method. So on its own, it's like nothing. But that's the beauty of it once you think about it. That's why it is secure. That's why it doesn't create side effects on your computer when evaluated, etc. So what side effects you want it to actually do? Well, that's your problem. That's your domain. So, and this, of course, varies from project to project.
So I guess, does that make it, in the loosest possible sense, a functional language as well, since it, by default, does not create any side effects?
A piece of, let me try to answer this correctly. A piece of Lizzie code is functional by the very definition of the term functional programming, because it has absolutely no side effects. The programming language isn't functional, but it's very close to being functional. And actually, I created a new release today where I argued with myself, should I make it functional? Meaning I only have pure functions in it, or should I not do that? And I kind of concluded with that it's easier to use if it is not 100% functional. So there are two levels of stacks in Lizzie. You have the global stack, where you can declare variables immediately at the root level of your Lizzie code. And then every time you invoke a function, you get an additional layer of stack where you can declare local variables. Now, if you modify a variable from your function, then if that variable exists on your local stack, the Lizzie code will change that local variable without touching the global variable at all. If that variable doesn't exist on the local function stack, then it will check to see if it exists in the global or root level stack. If it does, it will change that value. So a single Lizzie function can have side effects. Functions aren't pure necessarily in Lizzie. There's no contract guaranteeing you that the local function inside a piece of Lizzie snippet is pure. But the code by itself as a whole is pure until you start adding domain-specific language extensions to it in C#.
So then the tool, effectively, the language that you've created, like you said, it's by itself. It's not really that useful. It doesn't really do much. But you combine it with a bunch of methods that you've created that I suppose expose your business logic.
Yeah.
Because you can't really do your business logic in Lizzie, can you? If it's just basic addition and string manipulation and a few other things and for loops and things.
Exactly. So out of the box, it's arguably useless. You have to, at the very least, in order to be able to use it, create at least one extension method that you allow Lizzie to consume as a function from its code. That's the beauty of it. But the simplicity of creating such functions is really, I think, to be honest with you, quite astonishing, because it's just a simple method signature, an attribute, and making sure that you bind your Lizzie code to an instance of that type once you evaluate it. And that's a pretty cool, I think, of course I'm biased though, obviously, but I think that's a pretty cool way to have like a domain-specific language engine, quote unquote, to create your own domain-specific extensions to it, such that you have a dynamic scripting environment to evaluate your business logic within. And that's kind of like its USP too, I'd argue.
Where can people go to learn more about Lizzie as a project? And you've said that there's documentation, but is the documentation available alongside any binaries, or are there any example code that people can pull and extend and change somehow?
Yeah, the project is hosted at GitHub, and actually its entire documentation, and compare this to languages such as C# or C++ and JavaScript, which has several thousands of pages of reference documentation. Lizzie's entire documentation is only 12 pages, and arguably it's twice as big as it should be, because I'm never good enough to actually shave my words when I write documentation. You don't need to read more than 12 pages, at which point you've arguably become a master in Lizzie. And that's also a little bit of its beauty, I think. It's extreme naivety. So, I mean, if you want to learn everything about C++, it's probably 5,000 pages of literature. Well, if you want to learn everything about Lizzie, it's 12 pages. So, and it's at GitHub with the project.
Check the show notes. I'll put a whole bunch of links to stuff. Do you have any example applications that people can... Is there anything online that I can, like an API I can hit just to see that it's doing something, or is that not something you can expose easily to the outside world and say, hey, this API endpoint is running Lizzie, although you can't really see it?
I can actually even do better if you want to, because I've created and it's a quite naive application because it only does one thing. It's a .NET Core web API with one REST endpoint accepting only post requests, but renders in the browser. When it gets a GET request towards that same endpoint, it renders an MVC view that displays code mirror, two editors of code mirror, at which point you can actually just start debugging the project, and the browser pops up showing you syntax highlighting code editor inside your browser, allowing you to type in Lizzie code and see the results. And that's pretty cool, I think. So, and of course, this project is easily extendable because I think it's literally like 40, 50, or at least less than 100 lines of code in total, the project, allowing you to easily start playing around with creating your own extension methods and stuff like that. So that's a pretty cool example, I think, to get started with Lizzie and play with it. But I don't have any fully fledged apps doing Lizzie.
Are there example apps that I can pull from GitHub? Maybe like a Hello World or something that can sort of show me how to get started, so that then I can go, oh yes, there, and then I'll add a function here or I'll add some code there. Is there almost like a template showing things off?
Well, there's not a specific GitHub project, but there is a 15-line long, or I think it's 30 lines of code, example of a console application at its GitHub project website on its README file. That walks you through, okay, create a new console app, replace the code with this, bang, you've created your first Lizzie app, congratulations. And this binds one function to the Lizzie object, allowing you to do simple write lines to the console. But of course, taking it from there to selecting stuff from your database, doing whatever is very, very easy. So, because it's just to create new methods and bind them with the simple attributes. So I think it should be very easy to start with. I mean, I think it's easy to start with. I created the thing. So yeah, I might be wrong too. But I believe it is very easy to start with.
If listeners want to learn a little bit more about you and the work you're doing, should they go to the GitHub page and then is there a link from there? Or is there a better place for listeners to connect with you and ask questions or just learn more about what it is that you do and learn more about Lizzie?
Well, they can go to the GitHub project website. That's one way of reaching me. If they have support questions or stuff like that about Lizzie, I prefer getting them at GitHub because it's more scalable. So you have my Twitter handle already, I presume?
Sure, yeah, I'll put it into the show notes. So I think that's enough to get our listeners interested at the very least. Thank you very much for being on the show. It's a great pleasure to hear from different people in the community building stuff, and especially this. Lizzie could really blow the doors off of what we can achieve with ASP.NET Core at the very least. Yeah, so thank you ever so much for being on the show, Thomas.
Thank you very much for having me, James. So it's always fun to talk about your babies.
Thank you very much, Thomas, because this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed connecting with you and discussing Lizzie today.
Awesome.
That was my interview with Thomas Hansen. I'd love to hear what you think about Lizzie and how you might use it in your applications. As always, be sure to check out the show notes for a selection of links and a collection of text snippets from this interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. That's DOTNETCORE.SHOW. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or a review on your podcatcher of choice, and remember to come back next time for some .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.